The time has come, and the Citadel gates are opening. Millions of players are sprinting through the gates ready to do battle with the Lich King. But most of these players are making a huge mistake. They haven't planned the optimal raid comp to crush the heroic bosses. So instead of slaying the Lich King and taking his Frostmourne, they'll be blaming each other for wipes and disbanding their guilds. You, on the other hand, are smart. You clicked this video and you want to know the best comp to run for ICC. Luckily, I've got all the PTR data and 80 hours of personal ICC experience in heroic clears. So let's talk about the best raid comps for ICC 10 and 25 man. First though, let's talk methodology. To make this tier list, I've taken data from around 5,000 heroic ICC logs. With help from my friend and data wizard Forge, I've been able to piece together an optimal lineup for both 10 and 25 man raids. I'm also factoring in my extensive ICC experience and clears of every heroic boss, and Lich King normal, but we don't talk about that. There's a problem though. When you're building the perfect raid comp for Icecrown Citadel, there's something everybody tends to overlook. This is a retail style raid where every boss has drastically different mechanics and strategies. That means the optimal raid comp for Sourfang is very different from the optimal raid comp for Sindragosa. Some fights are better with 1 tank, some are better with 3. Some fights are better with ranged DPS stacks, some are better with melee stacks. Some fights are better with 3 healers, while some fights are even better with 7 or 8. And since most players don't want to be sitting on the bench for half the raid, we have to compromise. Instead of a perfect raid comp for individual fights, we need a flexible raid comp that can get the job done on every fight. There are 3 keys to make a perfect ICC raid comp. First, we need our team to be balanced to deal with a variety of fight styles in Icecrown Citadel. That means far less class stacking than in previous raids like TOC. The side benefit is that we'll be covering all the relevant class buffs at the same time. The second thing is that we need our team to have a lot of dual spec options. Having your Feral be able to swap to be a 3rd tank on a fight like Council is really big. Also, having your Holy Priest or your Resto Shaman able to switch to damage on a fight like Sourfang is huge. When there's a DPS check, you need to be able to cut healers, and when there's a heal check, you need to be able to add healers very easily. Hybrids can definitely play a role as well. For example, off-healing on Boomkin can be a good middle ground to meet DPS checks without losing too much healing. Alright, so we know the keys to a successful ICC raid comp, so let's get into the optimal 10-man raid comp. The optimal 10-man starts with the optimal 2 healers. Holy Paladin and Disc Priest are the bread and butter of any heroic 10-man team. Resto Shaman's definitely a viable alternative as well. Remember, you can get Fort Scrolls or Drums if you're missing a key buff. Unfortunately for Resto Druids though, this is where the imbalances of the 10-man really start to show. You just don't have the raw tank healing to get through fights like Lich King. Moving on to the tanks, we see an overwhelming majority of successful logs in 10-man featuring a Prot Paladin tank. A lot of fights do require 2 tanks though, and almost every second tank is a Blood Death Knight that dual specs to damage when not needed. This is definitely where some creativity comes in though. You can see a few logs here and there where Prot Warriors and Ferals are brought as well, it's just not as set in stone as healers. As for damage dealers, we can't really get a perfect comp since we'll always be missing some key buff and we can't really class stack like in old raids. We can use data, however, to look at the most successful comps and tweak things based on our available roster of players. From the PTR data, Demo Locks are a must-have 10-man class with their buffs and their high damage. The data says that 80% of 10-man groups brought at least 1 to the PTR. We definitely also want a Boomkin. Boomkin was even brought to the most 10-man PTRs according to the logs. The main reason for that is that they can easily dual spec or just hybrid heal on more intensive fights like Sindragosa. Of course, a 10-man raid without a battle res is also pretty miserable. Up next, we have Survival Hunters, and they're just really hot in 10-mans. You really need replenishment anyways, and you definitely want a Hunter for Lich King, plus they just got buffed. We also definitely have to bring a Shaman for Lust. Whether it's Enhanced or Ellie is up to you and what your comp's focused on. Rounding out the comp though, we have to decide between Ret Paladin or Mage with their Int and Mage Food. Ret was the most popular melee class by far for 10-man PTR, and their utility is just too good to pass up in my opinion. For the last slot, we can get more creative with a Combat Rogue or a Fury or an Unholy DK or even a Feral for more utility. Just make sure to bring the correct tanks and heals and prioritize Lust and Replenishment before filling out any other slots. There is one more empty slot, and that's in my heart because you haven't subscribed yet. Please fill that slot in, it really hurts. Okay, so now let's get into the 25-man, which is a far more creative endeavor. Once again, we start with the healer core, and once again, Paladins rule. 2 Holy Paladins are an absolute must, and these are the backbone of your raid. Next up, pretty much every successful heroic 25 kill featured 1 Disc Priest, and they're just too good to pass up. Then we have Resto Shamans, which are also brought as part of the early progression healing core. Having a second Lust for pets is great, and Mana Tide helps a lot with the long, slow progression fights. For our 5th healer, we have to choose between Resto Druid and Holy Priest. The PTR logs show far more Resto Druids, but Holy Priests have been less popular, so that makes sense. I do consider these healers to be pretty much interchangeable, though I prefer Battle Res and Innervate during progression. As for 6 and 7 heal fights, you just dual spec your Ellie Shaman or your Boomkin as necessary. Moving into tanks, it's pretty much the exact same story as 10-man. I would take a Prop Paladin all day alongside a Blood DK. Getting into damage, as a wise man once said, if it looks like a rainbow, you're probably doing it right. You really want to bring every possible buff and then stack the best ranged DPS to make fights like Lich King a lot easier. This isn't going to be Trial of the Crusader with 8 Unholy Death Knights, even though there were successful logs with 6 DKs. Since we're bringing a little bit of everything, the question becomes what to bring duplicates of. The most logical class to duplicate early on is Affliction Lock with their really high range DPS. Later on in the phase, it'll make more sense to duplicate Fire Mages instead, but they just aren't there yet DPS-wise. We also have to decide between 1 or 2 Hunters. They just got buffed and they're amazing on Lich King. If you want to replicate that classic feeling and stack melee like warriors, that's still on the table as well. The melee stack of your dreams will just have to wait a few months until you get full Bisque gear. If you want to start working towards that Bisque gear though, you'll actually have to be allowed in the raid. That's why my insanely fast ICC catch-up guide is perfect. Watch it next to get caught up fast.